Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. Jay here from Square Pegs, and I wanted to do a bit of a thought exercise with you guys today. Just kind of life happens sometimes, right? And we always run into situations where sometimes we have to purge things. We have to get rid of parts of the collection, just either to cover bills or to take care of an emergency situation that's come up. And it got me thinking today, like, if that happened, what would be the first 10 things I would buy back? I'm not going to go crazy here, and I'm not going to open this up to the entire collection because that would be an impossible video to make, but I think if I had to start from scratch again on my NES collection, which, keep in mind, I just kind of did about 2 years ago, these would be the 10 games I'd start with. Up first, The Legend of Zelda.
It doesn't get more iconic than The Legend of Zelda. Well, okay, maybe it does. Some people could point to Mario, of course, but for me, Zelda was my Nintendo property on the NES. As much as I loved Mario, Mario 2, and Mario 3, Zelda was one I came back to constantly. And it's something now where I look at it, if I were to rebuild a collection, I would go to Zelda before I would go to any of the Mario games because the memories wrapped up in it and the gameplay experience that's wrapped up in it is something that is hard to duplicate on other games, at least at the level of quality that Zelda offers. You can get other dungeon crawlers, other adventure games that have you going through a massive world, but you're not going to find many that play as well as the original Zelda does. And with platformers, there's a lot of options, so that's why I'd go with Zelda before I went with a Mario game. And it doesn't hurt that it's my wife's favorite series, so if I'm rebuilding a collection, it's not just for me. We play games together. I want to make sure I'm grabbing something that she would enjoy as well. So, The Legend of Zelda would be the one I would go with from Nintendo, that signature Nintendo game that I would use to rebuild my collection.
Next up, a game that I actually really appreciate. I've come to appreciate more and more. And it is kind of representing the entire series here, I'll be honest with you. This isn't necessarily the one I would pick, but it is the one I own. So, Mega Man 6.
So yeah, while Mega Man 6 is the stand-in for the entirety of the Mega Man series, I'm gonna be honest with you, the more I've thought about it, and the more I'm sitting here and playing it, I think this actually would be the one I'd pick. For no other reason than if I'm starting a collection, if I'm restarting my NES collection, why not go with something I haven't really played before? Give myself the opportunity to try something new. The game is almost 30 years old at this point, and I think I've played it maybe 4 or 5 times in my life. And all of the other Mega Mans that were on the NES, 1 through 5, were games that I owned when I was younger, and I played regularly. I mean, I beat Mega Man 2 and 3 almost annually, so I definitely don't need to add those to the collection immediately. I know them backwards, forwards, and in my sleep. But for something like this with Mega Man 6, I think I actually would go out of my way to pick this up to add it to my collection, because even though the system is older, even though I might not have the originals that I had when I was a kid, getting new things on the NES that I've never had the opportunity to play before that I know are going to be quality based on the pedigree of the company making it and the series they're in, I don't think that's a bad idea. So while this originally was a stand-in, like I said, I think this actually would be the Mega Man game I'd go with if I'm rebuilding a collection from scratch.
Next up, this is an underrated classic, something that a lot of people overlook. And it's something that I loved when I was a kid, and I just recently picked it back up again, and yeah, absolutely, I would add this back to my collection immediately. Kabuki Quantum Fighter.
Here's a game I just recently added back to my collection, and it's something that I loved when I was a kid, and that is Kabuki Quantum Fighter. This is one of those fantastic kind of weirdo platformers from the NES that plays a little bit like Batman, but is decidedly its own thing. This is made by HAL, which is super awesome. I love HAL. And it's something that takes the platformer, beat-em-up action genre and kind of turns it on the side of its head a little bit because you're in the future, you're sucked into a computer, and you have to go through and fight a virus. And it's as silly as it sounds. It's definitely a very early 1990s kind of plot, but the gameplay is spectacular. It looks wonderful, it plays really great, and the sound is really fun. And while I would love to say that, kind of obscure platformers are the way to go on the NES, adding stuff like Power Blade or Shatterhand or Power Blade 2, that's kind of cost prohibitive. Like, you're not going to start a collection with Power Blade 2. You're going to kind of end a collection with Power Blade 2. But something like Kabuki Quantum Fighter, which is low to mid 20s in value, you can really work on rebuilding a collection with that, because you're not going to hamstring yourself by spending a ton of money on another game. You can buy this and a bunch of other ones as well.
Next up, yeah, while I'm able to get this now in the Cowabunga collection on the Switch, there's nothing like having the original. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game.
There were a ton of arcade ports on the NES, and none of them, in my eyes, were ever better than Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game. And there are plenty of modern options to play this now. Like, you can emulate it, you can play it on the Cowabunga collection, you could have even bought the arcade version, like the legit arcade version on Xbox Live Arcade if you had a 360, but there's just something kind of special about the original NES version. It plays fantastically well. Like, this was such a great interpretation of what the arcade game was, that even though it wasn't one-to-one and it was missing a whole hell of a lot from what the arcade experience offered, it was still good enough, and it was still something where you could pop this in with a friend on the couch and just rip through this game and have an absolute blast. This is one of the best multiplayer games on the NES, and it is one of my favorite beat-em-ups of all time. For just a fantastic representation of the beat-em-up genre, something that is a metric ton of fun to play and still looks good to this day, Turtles 2, the arcade game, I would absolutely restart a collection with.
Much like Turtles 2, the arcade game, it doesn't get any better than the original on the NES, and that would be DuckTales. Woohoo!
There are no shortage of fantastic licensed games on the NES, and as anyone who has watched the channel for a while knows, I'm a sucker for licensed games. And one of the best, one of the top tier ones of all time, not just on the NES, is DuckTales. This is something that took a beloved Disney afternoon property, a cartoon I watched almost every day, and turned it into somehow a better video game. It's something that, while it is clearly inspired by Mega Man and borrows heavily from those design aesthetic, it leans into the property it's based on and makes its own mark and makes itself completely unique by just being a fantastic Scrooge McDuck adventure. The controls are great, the look of the game is wonderful, the music is some of the best on the NES. Nostalgia is a powerful drug, right? Like, it's something that I think we all experience, especially with these older games that we love so much. And it's easy to look at something like a DuckTales and kind of get blinded by it, because it's twofold. It's both a nostalgic cartoon that we loved and an NES game that we loved. And it's easy to kind of put on the rose-colored glasses and think it's better than it was, but this game is legit. It's just as good today as it was back then. This is my copy I've had my whole life, and were I rebuilding a collection, this would be one of the first ones I'd get because of how great of a game it is.
You guys know I'm no stranger to sports games. I do enjoy the sports games from time to time. One of my favorite games on the NES, and it's actually something I picked up with John Riggs back in Columbus this year, is Baseball Simulator 1000.
There are no shortage of fantastic sports games on the NES, and while I was very close to saying, you know what, Blades of Steel is the one, or Ice Hockey is the one, if I'm being honest with myself, the game that is a signature sports experience to me on the NES is Baseball Simulator 1000. It does everything right. There's a full season mode in play here. You're able to play this straight up as normal baseball, or you can play with the hyper teams and have crazy power-ups and just ridiculous action on the field at all time. And it's just so much fun. Like, it's not a looker of a game, I will grant you that. There are definitely better looking sports games out there and better looking baseball games on the NES, but I would challenge you to find one that plays better. It's almost the perfect sports experience for the NES because it does so much with so little on the controller. It's one that I love. It's one that I was on the hunt for a while at a good price. And when I found it in Columbus, when John Riggs and I were at Capitol Games, this was an immediate buy for me because the price was so good. It's something that, were I rebuilding my collection today, I would buy probably within the first couple of weeks, because getting it back and playing it again, I was reminded immediately of how much fun it is.
Another spectacular Capcom game and one of my favorites, Little Nemo the Dream Master, is one of my favorites.
The character of Little Nemo is something that I knew about when I was younger. My grandfather was an artist, and he drew constantly, and my mom was an artist. She was a photographer. So I was always encouraged to go after art that I loved, and I loved comic strips when I was younger. And going to the library and checking out older comic strips and learning about characters like Tintin, or learning about Asterix and Obelix, which were not big in the United States, and then discovering Little Nemo when I was younger just kind of blew my mind. And then finding out that there was going to be a video game about Little Nemo, oh my god. If you have never read the Little Nemo comics, you need to look up Little Nemo in Slumberland, because Winsor McCay is someone that was decades ahead of his time in composition and just the way he built his world. It was an absolutely stunning visual representation of what a dreamland would be. And getting this game from Capcom, which, while it was decidedly its very own take on McKay's vision, it was something that was not only faithful to the spirit of the comic strip, it was something that made its own mark using the property. And this is such an important game because of that. To me personally, I understand that this isn't going to be something that's important to everybody, but for me personally, as someone who loves the medium of comics, this is an important game, and this would absolutely be something I buy immediately to rebuild a collection with.
When we moved to Michigan, this was the first game I bought. So this legitimately would be right near the top of the list, and I know it's right at the top of the list for a lot of people, and that is Batman. I really like this one because it's got the hole punched. Hi, there's my eyeball. You can actually see the hole punched in it, and it says Bronson Child Life. Our local hospital here is Bronson, and this came from their kind of, I guess, game cart for kids, and I think that's pretty cool. I'm never getting rid of this one.
Those of you that have been around the channel for a while know how much I adore superhero games. I've been a comic book fan my entire life, and superhero video games are things that I've always loved. And Batman on the NES stands the test of time. Like, this is a 30-year-old plus game at this point, and it's still spectacular. There's nothing about this that shows age where you sit back and you go, well, I mean, it was a great NES game. No, it's just a great game. It's something that when I was younger, this was never a game I owned. This was a game that I rented constantly. And it was something that when I got a little bit older and I bought my first copy of this game when I was in my 20s, it was something that I really loved and I really cherished. And unfortunately, when we moved, I had to get rid of it because I was trying to get enough money to be able to have us have a little bit of a nest egg when we moved to Michigan. And while getting rid of the game down in Florida was a disappointment, getting the game up here in Michigan, and this was actually probably the first NES game I bought where I was rebuilding my collection when I decided to get back into owning retro games. Batman was the first one I bought, and it was specifically because of this copy, because this was something that was in the Bronson Children's Hospital, and it's just so cool to me that this was something that legitimately helped people.
Next, one of my favorite RPGs, probably my favorite RPG on the system, and one that I've worked hard to get complete in box, and one I would build back to complete in box again, and that is Final Fantasy.
Final Fantasy wasn't the first RPG I'd ever played. That was The Bard's Tale on my Commodore 64, but it was the first RPG I'd ever really fallen head over heels in love with on a home console. I had played Dragon Warrior before Final Fantasy, but Dragon Warrior was a bit clunky. And Final Fantasy streamlined so much and just made me dive into the world of the Warriors of Light, into this amazing magical world. It set the stage for so many fantastic RPG adventures that I've gone on since that it's hard to overstate how influential and important Final Fantasy is. I loved this game growing up. I still love it today, despite the fact that now, 30 years after its release, I can look at it and say there are definitely some clunky bits about it. But it's such a landmark game and something that is still fun to play that I think, were I to be rebuilding an NES collection, like I kind of have been, it's something that I think would be necessary to add. Because I love the game so much, I'm kind of on a continuing quest to make sure that I have the best possible version of this complete in box. And while I'm there right now, there's still upgrades I could make. There's still box upgrades, manual upgrades, the map upgrades. It's something that I want to keep moving forward towards, and because of that, I have to include it on this list.
Last but certainly not least, and absolutely number one with a bullet, and that is Star Tropics. My wife got this for me a couple of years ago for Christmas, and it is just one of my absolute favorite things.
Star Tropics was easily one of my favorite games growing up. It's something that I've played a million times, but I've only beaten a few times in my life just because it's a fairly difficult game and there's a lot to it. But there's something about the world of Star Tropics and the world of Sea Island and trying to rescue Dr. J as Mike and fighting Zoda that is just kind of magical to me. Like, this game here in particular holds a lot of really nostalgic appeal to me. This was the only game I was ever allowed to call the Nintendo helpline on because I couldn't figure out how to beat the ghost boss. It was a game that I immediately knew I wanted to have complete in box, but I never really had the means to do so, and it wasn't something I ever actively pursued. So this copy I have here that I showed off leading into this game is something that my wife got for me for Christmas because she knew how important it was to me. And when someone you care about does something for you like that and actively takes part in helping you add things to a collection that is dear to you and that is something that is important to you, it's really hard to replace that. So if I ever had to get rid of Star Tropics for any reason, and I don't ever foresee that happening, if I ever had to get rid of it, this would probably be the first one I would buy back just because of how important it is to me for the copy my wife got me.
So there you have it, guys. My 10 games that if I had to purge my collection, if I had to get rid of all of my NES collection, these are the 10 that I would buy back first. Let me know in the comments below what your 10 games are that you would get back first on the NES and the reasons why. I'd love to hear the stories behind these because games are special to different people for different reasons, and those nostalgia goggles we wear are very powerful. And the beauty of gaming is that everything hits different for every single person. I know for a lot of people, they're probably going to look at this and say, why aren't any of the Mario games on the list? Because for me, the Mario games are great, but Mega Man was the thing that brought me back to my NES. Mega Man, DuckTales, Little Nemo. Capcom was my favorite publisher, and while I love Mario 3 and I love Mario 2 and Super Mario Brothers, yeah, they're great games. They're not games I would pursue right away. I don't own any of them except Super Mario Brothers 1, so obviously I wouldn't pursue them, but these games here are the ones I would go after, so let me know what your 10 are. Thank you to my patrons you guys are seeing on screen right now. Really appreciate you guys being here, and as always, remember to play more games, stay square, and take care. I'll talk to you soon.